All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. We are back on the Recollection Road channel. It says bizarre things people believed 60 years ago. Just trying to do some calculation here. All right. We're going to check this out. Appreciate all the love and support with you guys coming over and watching. As always, I'll leave the link to their channel in the description. We ain't going to waste no more time. Let's jump right into it.
Rediscover your past by digitizing your family's memories with Legacy Box. Watch until the end of this video to find out more about preserving your legacy, and then visit legacybox.com/recollection.
See what they got. How bizarre this is.
History is full of crazy weight loss devices and pills that promise to melt the fat away while you sleep. But one of the craziest devices ever invented was the vibrating belt workout machine, which was supposed to jiggle the fat off you while you stood there. The vibrating belt machine was a must-have device in fitness centers for decades, even though health experts knew early on that they were essentially useless.
Dang.
Still, people found them appealing because they thought they had that magic something that delivered weight loss without diet and exercise.
That's key, man, the diet.
In the 1960s, most people thought that drunk driving was more of a rite of passage than a crime, and some juries felt the same way too. In those days, if you were arrested for driving under the influence, you didn't admit guilt. You asked for a jury trial.
What?
That's because in most states, there was no strict limit on blood alcohol levels. So convicting you wasn't just a matter of giving you a breathalyzer test. The state had to prove that you were not only drinking, but that the alcohol had impaired your ability to safely operate your vehicle.
That is insane.
Years ago, public high schools often had shooting clubs, and sometimes even gun ranges on campus. And since practices were held after class, kids could take their guns to school with them, so they could go straight to the shooting range after school let out. Students would usually turn their weapons over to their homeroom teachers when they got to school, so technically they weren't roaming the halls with it slung across their back.
Oh my goodness.
Although this practice has pretty much died out, some schools still offer shooting clubs, although the ranges that existed on high school campuses back then have been moved to new locations.
I'm flabbergasted.
People genuinely once thought that exposing their bodies to radiation could cure various ailments and provide a miraculous fountain of youth. From radium-based beauty creams to radiation therapy devices sold for home use, it's safe to say that people had a misguided trust in the powers of radiation. And who could blame them? Because radium was found to exist in natural hot spring waters, which were hailed for their curative powers.
Man, this is insane.
It was marketed as a wonder cure for all sorts of ailments, but it was discovered that the tolerance was lower than expected, and exposure to radium caused long-term cell damage that could appear 40 years after usage. Most modern flight attendants can't stand to be called a stewardess because the word harkens back to a time when a woman just had to look good in a miniskirt. In those days, to get a job as a stewardess, you had to be at least 20 years old, but no older than 27. You also had to be thin and well-proportioned, weighing no more than 140 pounds.
Damn.
And of course, you had to be unmarried and childless. So basically, that meant that the two primary qualifications for serving bags of peanuts and ginger ale were that you had to be beautiful and single. Job training included lessons on how to walk and stand sexy, and how to do your makeup and hair. If these things weren't maintained, you could be suspended too. Oh, and retirement for a flight attendant occurred at the ripe old age of 32.
Damn, man.
Heart disease was rare in middle-aged people up until the 1950s, but suddenly people started dropping like flies. But at that time, everyone blamed saturated fat for the epidemic. So people went on believing that sugar was totally fine, while things like eggs were villainized. Naturally sweetened with honey was no longer enough. Candies, cereals, desserts, and sugary drinks were filled with refined sugar that tended to stay with you forever in the form of belly fat. Most were okay with that, because let's face it, sugar is delicious. Fortunately for the sugar industry, that was all the time they needed for us all to become irreversibly addicted to sugar, despite knowing the health effects.
This is a wild video.
It was once perfectly acceptable for banks to ask credit card applicants questions like, "Are you married?" or "Do you plan to have kids?" but only if the applicants were women. And if you weren't married, the bank expected you to bring a man with you to co-sign. So effectively, unmarried women were deemed not responsible enough to have a credit card. Banks could also give women reduced credit limits compared to men who earned a similar salary. It was certainly a different time, with fewer women in the workforce, and banks just didn't have the confidence to lend their money to some women, especially the ones without a husband.
This is extremely crazy.
60 years ago, people thought seatbelts were annoying and oppressive, and for the most part, they didn't even want the things in their cars. By the early 1960s, seatbelts were optional equipment on most cars, but that didn't really change anything. They still didn't want them, and even those who had them really didn't use them. In 1968, legislation was passed requiring seatbelts to be standard equipment in all cars, but things still didn't change much. It would take until the 1980s before wearing seatbelts would really catch on, and much of that was due to the law enforcement push that could get you a ticket if you weren't wearing it.
Crazy, man.
Asbestos has a long, dark history of use as a building material, and an equally long and dark history of people pretending like it didn't make you sick. As far back as the 1st century, those who mined for asbestos would often become ill. But because those doing the mining were usually slaves, most people didn't take notice.
Yeah.
It wasn't until many centuries later that anyone else documented that asbestos was linked to illness. In 1918, the US government realized that asbestos workers were dying at young ages. Study after study followed that initial report, but by the 1960s, the asbestos industry was still promoting their product, and they were still neglecting to provide their workers with proper safety equipment, or even warn them of the dangers. And so it continued to be standard practice to use deadly asbestos in homes and buildings up until the 1960s, and in some cases, even longer than that.
This title is
The
perfect.
1960s was full of sage advice from grandmothers and magazine editors about the very best ways to keep a man happy. 17 magazine was one of the worst offenders of this. In 1967, they published a book of advice entitled The 17 Book of Fashion and Beauty, which among other things, advised young women to always be on a diet and avoid wearing eyeglasses. But the most bizarre advice of all had to do with a girl's voice. It was encouraged that one must also sound pretty, find the perfect pitch, stand up straight, and of course, always smile while speaking. The gentleness, warmth, and vitality in your voice let others know you were a lady. Let me know in the comments if I missed anything, and maybe...
Man, this had to be one of the most craziest video. The gun, bringing the guns to school one took the cake for me. That is just, I couldn't believe that. Especially thinking about like today. Whew. Oh man. Like they could have titled the video "Craziest Things People Believe 60 Years Ago." This was absolutely insane. My goodness, man. All right, that is going to do it. Comment down below what was the craziest thing in here that you seen, and did you know about any of this stuff? Please. All right, peace out.